My father hit the polished mahogany desk hard enough to make the branch manager flinch. Douglas Bennett never raised his voice in public. He built his entire reputation in Boise on quiet control and firm handshakes. Yet here he stood, face flushed red, a formal fraud alert resting between his heavy work boots and the banker. He pointed a thick finger at the manager, demanding access to the accounts he drained. The manager simply pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and stated the signature on the withdrawal constituted a federal offense. I sat in the corner leather chair holding a paper cup of lukewarm water. I did not blink. I did not speak. To understand how a prominent Idaho agricultural patriarch ended up staring down a felony charge in a suburban bank lobby, you have to rewind 3 months. The wind outside our modern farmhouse carried the sharp scent of pine and early snow. Inside, the climate was curated and expensive. My parents poured coastal tech money into their generational farming roots, installing reclaimed wood beams and imported marble. We sat around a dining table that cost more than my first car. The occasion was a celebration. My younger sister Paige sat at the head of the table. At 24, she wore a pristine cashmere sweater, her blonde hair styled into deliberate waves. She possessed a pageant-ready charm my parents treated as a substitute for character. I sat near the kitchen swing door. At 28, I worked as a data analyst for an agricultural tech firm downtown. I pulled 60-hour weeks, paid my own rent, and navigated the world with quiet precision. To my parents, my independence was an inconvenience. It meant I did not feed their egos. My father stood. He tapped a heavy brass pen against his crystal flute. That pen was a 20-year anniversary gift from the regional cooperative. He carried it everywhere in his flannel shirt pocket, refusing to sign anything unless it was with its distinct indigo ink. He raised his glass to Paige, his voice booming with the practiced warmth he reserved for city council meetings. He announced that tomorrow she would sign the lease on her storefront downtown. She saw a gap in the luxury market, and she took the leap. My mother, Valerie, beamed from the opposite end. She adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet she wore just to ensure the neighbors noticed it. She chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, saying, "They were so proud." She turned her gaze toward me. The smile remained, but her eyes hardened into polished stones. She said, "It just goes to show what happens when you apply yourself." She told the table they invested in Paige because she actually does something with her life. Paige took a delicate sip of champagne, offering me a patronizing pout. She remarked that some people are builders and some people just process data. I cut a piece of roasted lamb. I told her congratulations, keeping my tone perfectly flat. My father chuckled and finished his drink, the brass pen gleaming in his pocket. They thought they had won. They thought they were the benevolent monarchs of a prosperous family, generously funding their favorite daughter. What they did not know was that I had already seen the numbers. I knew exactly where the seed money for Paige's boutique came from. It was not a business loan. It was not a second mortgage. Her storefront was funded by a $250,000 trust fund left exclusively to me by my late grandfather. The account had been drained to a zero balance. My own parents forged my consent to steal my future. Before I take you further into how I dismantled their perfect lives, I have a question for you. Have you ever sat at a holiday table, biting your tongue until you tasted copper, watching the people who stole your future accept praise for their generosity? Tell me your current age in the comments, and let me know if you have ever been the family scapegoat. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to Zara Told Stories, but only if this story earns it. I watched Paige list off her planned inventory. Italian leather display cases, custom brass lighting fixtures, Each word she spoke was a receipt. Every luxury she described was an itemized debt. The sheer entitlement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mother leaned forward, asking Paige about the marketing strategy. I took a slow sip of ice water, letting the cold settle in my chest. For years, I shrank myself to fit the quiet box they built for me. I absorbed their subtle jabs and unequal treatment. I let them erase my achievements because it was easier than fighting a war I could never win. But theft changes the dynamic. You can ignore a bruised ego. You cannot ignore financial decimation. My grandfather was a hardened man who worked the Idaho soil with his bare hands. He saw right through my father's obsession with status. He set up that trust to ensure I had a safety net far away from their control. He locked it down with strict stipulations. I looked at the brass pen resting in my father's pocket. He loved that pen. He used it to sign every important document, a mark of his supposed authority. My mind raced through the data points. To bypass the bank security, they needed my notarized signature. They assumed I would never check the account until I was ready to buy a house years down the line. They assumed I would remain the obedient, invisible daughter who never questioned their authority. They were wrong. Paige laughed at something my father said. The sound was bright and hollow. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over my skin. I did not need to yell. I did not need to flip the table or beg for their approval. The moment my father forged my consent to drain that account, he stopped being an untouchable patriarch. He became a liability waiting for an audit. As a data analyst, I excel at finding the anomalies the system tries to hide. I know how to track numbers. I know how to follow the paper trail. Sitting in that dining room, surrounded by imported marble and stolen dreams, I made a silent vow. I would not give them a single warning shot. I would gather the proof, thread the needle, and let them walk blindly into their own execution. My mother insisted on serving the meal on her grandmother's china, a deliberate performance of old money elegance that clashed with the dirt tracks my father often left on the porch. I watched her cut her meat with precise, tiny movements. She spent her entire adult life curating an image of the perfect rural elite family. Paige was her masterpiece, a beautiful extension of her own vanity. I was the rough draft they wanted to hide in a drawer. When I announced my promotion to senior data analyst a month prior, my father had simply grunted and turned up the volume on the evening news. Tonight, he was giving a 5-minute speech about Paige signing a commercial lease. The contrast painted a clear picture of my worth in their eyes. My worth was 0. Literally. I finished my meal in silence. I helped clear the plates carrying the heavy china into the pristine kitchen. The cold water from the faucet rushed over my hands as I scrubbed the grease from the roasting pan. Through the swinging door, I could hear them discussing the grand opening guest list. The mayor, the head of the agricultural board, the elite of Boise society. They were planning a coronation, funded by my stolen inheritance. I dried my hands on a linen towel. I folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. The burning anger that usually accompanied their slights was gone, replaced by a crystalline focus. I knew what I had to do next. Tomorrow morning, the bank opened at 9. I would be their first customer. I walked back into the dining room, retrieved my coat, and told them I had an early morning meeting. My mother barely looked up from her dessert. My father offered a dismissive wave. I stepped out into the freezing Idaho night, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs. I started my car and let the engine idle, watching the warm light spill from the farmhouse windows. The trap was already waiting. They just did not know the jaws were open. 3 days before that celebratory dinner, the catalyst arrived in a thick ivory envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. I found it shoved into my rusted aluminum mailbox outside my modest apartment complex. The paper felt heavy, carrying the distinct texture of bureaucratic authority. A certified mail slip was stapled to the front, requiring a signature I had scribbled blindly before the postal carrier walked away. I carried the envelope upstairs, the worn wooden steps groaning under my boots. My apartment was a sharp contrast to my parents' curated farmhouse. It consisted of a small living space, a hand-me-down sofa, and a scratched laminate kitchen table where I spent my evenings crunching data sets. I tossed my keys on the counter, poured a cup of stale coffee from the morning pot, and tore open the seal. The document inside was not a standard tax return confirmation. It was a formal audit notification. My eyes scanned the dense legal typography, searching for the anomaly. Being a data analyst, I process information by seeking the outliers, the numbers that disrupt the established pattern. I found the outlier halfway down the second page. The Internal Revenue Service flagged a staggering capital gains tax discrepancy tied directly to my Social Security number. The notice detailed a liquidation event. An investment account had been emptied, triggering a severe tax liability for unreported income. I traced my index finger across the stark black ink, stopping at the exact dollar amount listed. $250,000. My chest tightened. The breath caught in my throat, refusing to move into my lungs. The room around me seemed to tilt, the hum of the refrigerator fading into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I gripped the edge of the cheap table, grounding myself against the sudden wave of vertigo. There was only one account in the world bearing my name with that kind of balance. The air in the room grew cold as a memory surfaced, pulling me back 10 years. I closed my eyes and let the past flood my senses. I was 18 years old, sitting on the wooden wraparound porch of the original Bennett farm. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel fuel, and cured tobacco. Beside me sat my grandfather, Elias. He was a hardened Idaho farmer, a man whose knuckles were permanently stained with topsoil and grease. He built the family wealth with his bare hands, long before my father inherited the land and transformed the humble property into an ostentatious display of new money. Elias possessed a quiet wisdom, speaking only when the words carried weight. He held a sealed manila envelope in his lap, his calloused thumbs rubbing the edges of the paper. He turned to me, his weathered face etched with deep lines of exhaustion and clarity. He handed me the envelope. Inside lay the legal documentation for a private trust established exclusively in my name. I remember the gravity in his voice, raspy from years of breathing in harvest dust. He looked toward the driveway where my father was busy polishing a brand new luxury truck. I locked this account because your father measures love in dollars. Do not let him touch it. Elias saw Douglas for exactly who he was. A man desperate for validation, willing to trade genuine connection for the appearance of success. My grandfather bypassed his own son, placing the future directly into my hands. The trust was designed to remain sealed until my 25th birthday, acting as an impenetrable shield against my parents' financial vanity. I opened my eyes, the memory dissolving back into the harsh reality of my cramped kitchen. I stared down at the crinkled IRS notice, my hands trembling as I smoothed out the creases. The account was gone. My shield was shattered. The sheer audacity of the crime paralyzed me. My parents did not just display favoritism by ignoring my milestones. They did not just neglect me emotionally. They reached into my future, hollowed it out, and handed the spoils to Paige so she could play dress-up as a luxury boutique owner. Worse still, they left me holding the bag for the federal tax penalty. They ruined me to fund her ego. A burning surge of adrenaline pushed me up from the chair. My immediate instinct was visceral and reckless. I wanted to grab my car keys, drive the 20 miles to their pristine farmhouse, and kick the front door off its hinges. I wanted to throw this crumpled treasury document into my father's face and scream until my vocal cords frayed. I wanted to watch his smug, curated persona shatter into pieces. I took one step toward the door before my analytical mind slammed the brakes. Emotion is a vulnerability. Anger, while justified, is a chaotic variable that leads to sloppy execution. If I drove to that house and confronted them without preparation, they would weaponize my fury. Douglas would gaslight me, claiming he moved the money for my own good. Valerie would cry on command, turning herself into the victim and painting me as the unstable, ungrateful daughter. They spent decades perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. I retreated from the door, taking a slow, deep breath. I pushed the anger down into a cold, dark place inside my chest, locking it away. I needed to shift paradigms. I could no longer view them as my parents. They were a corrupted data set. They were a fraudulent variable that needed to be isolated, exposed, and dismantled. I sat back down at the laminate table and opened my laptop. The blue light illuminated the dark kitchen. To execute this theft, they had to bypass rigorous banking security protocols. As the former custodial guardian of the account when I was a minor, my father possessed a foundational level of access. However, the stipulations Elias put in place were ironclad. Once I turned 25, the custodial privileges evaporated. No funds could be moved, transferred, or withdrawn without my explicit, notarized, written consent. Douglas and Valerie crossed a line that separated toxic parenting from federal criminality. This was wire fraud. This was identity theft. This was tax evasion. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I logged into every secure portal tied to my identity. I pulled my credit reports from all 3 major bureaus, scrutinizing every inquiry, every open line, every closed account. I downloaded 7 years of tax transcripts. I accessed the digital archives of the county clerk, pulling public property records and business filings. I printed page after page, the cheap inkjet printer whirring and grinding in the silence of my apartment. I meticulously gathered my identity documents, my birth certificate, my social security card, my current driver's license. I retrieved the original sealed manila envelope Elias gave me 10 years ago, pulling out the fragile yellowed pages of the original trust agreement. I arranged the papers into neat, categorized stacks on my table. I built a comprehensive dossier of their financial movements. The evidence painted a devastating picture. The withdrawal from my trust aligned perfectly with the business registration date for Paige's new storefront. I stared at the paperwork, a chilling realization settling over me. They assumed I was ignorant. They assumed I would remain the quiet, compliant scapegoat who never checked her balances, never questioned their authority, and never dared to look behind the curtain of their manufactured wealth. They banked on my silence. I slid the documents into a rigid, waterproof portfolio case. I zipped it shut, the sound sharp and definitive in the quiet room. I would give them nothing. No tears, no arguments, no warning shots. I would let them drink their expensive champagne. I would let them toast to Paige's stolen success. I would sit at their dining table and smile, holding the knowledge of their impending destruction behind my teeth. The next morning, I would take my portfolio downtown. I would walk into the main branch of the financial institution that held my grandfather's legacy. I needed to see exactly how my father broke the lock. I needed to see the signature that authorized the ruin of my future. The morning air bit at my cheeks as I walked toward the downtown Boise branch of First Heritage Financial. The building was an imposing structure of limestone and dark glass, a physical representation of old money guarding its secrets. I arrived 10 minutes before the doors officially opened, standing on the frost-covered pavement with my waterproof portfolio tucked under my arm. My breath plumed in the freezing air, but my heart beat with a slow, measured rhythm. When the security guard finally unlocked the heavy glass doors, I walked straight past the teller line and approached the reception desk. I requested an immediate meeting with Jonathan Wallace, the senior branch manager. Jonathan Wallace was a relic of a bygone banking era. He wore impeccably tailored suits, kept his silver hair parted sharply on the left, and believed a firm handshake held more weight than a credit score. He had managed my grandfather Elias's accounts for 3 decades. He knew the Bennett family lineage, which meant he knew my father, Douglas. In a community where reputation served as currency, my father traded on the perceived integrity of our farming legacy. Wallace trusted that legacy. Today, I was going to show him the rot underneath it. Wallace stood up behind his expansive mahogany desk as the receptionist ushered me into his office. He offered a warm, professional smile, gesturing to one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. He asked how the family was doing, mentioning he had seen Douglas at the Rotary Club breakfast last week. I did not return the smile. I unzipped the portfolio and pulled out the crisp IRS audit notification, sliding it across the polished wood surface. I told him I needed to see the withdrawal authorization for the trust account, ending in 472. Wallace glanced at the document. The warmth vanished from his features, replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a man realizing a crisis had just breached his walls. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes scanning the federal seal and the staggering penalty figure. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, the mechanical clicks echoing in the quiet office. He explained that my father came in a few months ago, presenting the necessary paperwork to consolidate family assets for a new commercial venture. Wallace said Douglas assured him the paperwork was in perfect order. I kept my voice devoid of emotion. I reminded Wallace that the parameters established by my grandfather were irrevocable. The trust required my physical presence, proper identification, and a notarized signature for any distribution of assets. I asked him to pull the physical copy of the authorization form. The silence in the office stretched thin, humming with impending consequence. Wallace picked up his desk phone, dialing the records department with a trembling finger. He requested the hard copy of the transfer request. We waited in the tense quiet. I watched the second-hand tick on the brass clock sitting on his shelf. Every movement in the room felt magnified. A clerk entered a few minutes later, handing Wallace a manila folder. He opened it, his face draining of color. He hesitated before rotating the file and pushing it toward me. I stared down at the single sheet of paper that dismantled my future. It was a standard wire transfer authorization, filled out with immaculate precision. At the bottom, on the line designated for the beneficiary, sat my name. But it was not my handwriting. I leaned forward, relying on my training as a data analyst. I look for the physical evidence of anomalies. I ran my index finger over the signature. The paper was deeply grooved. The person who signed this pressed down with immense, heavy pressure, treating the act of signing not as a fluid motion, but as a rigid exertion of force. Then I looked at the color. It was not standard black or basic ballpoint blue. The ink was a rich, distinct indigo. The image flashed in my mind with perfect clarity. The celebratory dinner table, the crystal flutes, my father tapping his pocket, the heavy brass pen, a 20-year anniversary gift from the agricultural cooperative, always loaded with custom indigo ink cartridges. Douglas never used anything else. He did not just bully a teller into bending a rule. He sat in this bank, looked a manager in the eye, and committed deliberate, calculated forgery. I looked up at Wallace. His skin had turned a sickly shade of gray. He realized the catastrophic error his institution made. By prioritizing my father's social standing over protocol, the bank facilitated a $250,000 fraud. Wallace stammered, attempting to apologize, claiming they would launch an internal review to understand how the notary stamp was acquired. He began to talk about institutional liability and insurance protocols. I held up a hand, cutting off his frantic spiral. I did not want the bank to simply sweep this under the rug with an insurance payout. An insurance claim would turn my father into a faceless statistic. I needed Douglas to face the undeniable reality of his actions. I needed the consequence to land squarely on his shoulders, crushing the arrogant facade he presented to the world. I informed Wallace that the $250,000 was now legally classified as stolen funds. The money my father used to secure the commercial lease for Paige was illicit. Every designer fixture, every square foot of Italian leather, every drop of champagne at that boutique was purchased with stolen capital. Douglas owed me a staggering debt, and I was going to collect it. I leaned back in the leather chair, establishing my authority in a room designed to intimidate. I told Wallace we were going to contain this situation on my terms. My father utilized a linked master profile to view all our family accounts, a holdover from when Paige and I were minors. I instructed Wallace to initiate a hard, uncompromising legal freeze on every single account bearing the Bennett name. Checking savings, credit lines, commercial business accounts, everything. Wallace wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. He nodded, typing the commands into his terminal. He stated the freeze would flag the accounts for fraudulent activity, locking out all users immediately. I stopped him before he hit the final keystroke. I needed a buffer. I needed time to set the next stage of the trap without arousing suspicion. If Douglas received an alert today, he would scramble to hide assets or manipulate the narrative before I was ready. I told Wallace to implement the freeze, but to place a 48-hour delay on the automated notification system. I demanded that no banker teller or manager reach out to Douglas. The accounts would simply show as active until the exact moment the grace period expired, at which point the digital doors would slam shut. Wallace looked at me, a mixture of fear and newfound respect shining in his eyes. He asked if I was sure about the delay, warning me that Douglas might attempt further transactions. I replied that further transactions were exactly what I wanted. Let him spend. Let him commit further to the commercial lease. Let Paige order more inventory. The higher they climbed on their ladder of stolen money, the more devastating the fall would be. Wallace pressed the enter key. The system accepted the command. The invisible timer started ticking. I stood up, sliding the forged document into my portfolio. I thanked him for his cooperation, noting that I would return with my legal counsel if the bank deviated from my instructions. Wallace assured me the branch would comply fully. I walked out of the office, crossing the marble floor of the lobby with purposeful strides. The crisp morning air hit my face as I exited the building. I checked my watch. I had exactly 48 hours before my parents' financial world imploded. Now I needed to make sure they were looking the wrong way when the explosion happened. I needed to feed their ego one last time. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my father's contact, preparing to play the role of the desperate, helpless daughter they always wanted me to be. The trap required bait, and I knew exactly what kind of deception would make Douglas lower his guard. I pulled into the concrete parking garage of my office building. The agricultural tech firm occupied the top 3 floors of a renovated warehouse in downtown Boise. My daily reality involved dual monitors, complex algorithms, and predicting crop yields using satellite imagery. It was grueling, unglamorous work. I built predictive models that saved real farmers genuine capital. Paige, on the other hand, spent her mornings curating aesthetic mood boards and selecting Pantone colors for her boutique shopping bags. I produced actual value. She merely performed the pantomime of success. I sat at my desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I stared at the blank screen of my phone. The 48-hour timer was officially ticking. Mr. Wallace had locked the accounts in the banking system, but the notification delay gave me a narrow window to manipulate my parents' perception. If I stayed silent, Douglas might grow suspicious. He possessed the cunning paranoia of a man who spent his life projecting a false image. I needed to feed his ego. I needed to hand him a narrative he desperately wanted to believe. He wanted a failure to contrast against his golden child. I decided to give him exactly that. I dialed his number. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I needed to sound small. I needed to sound desperate. He answered on the third ring. He barked his greeting over the sound of a roaring diesel engine. I pictured him sitting in his pristine, oversized truck, surveying land he inherited rather than earned. "Dad," I said, letting my voice waver. "I am sorry to bother you during the day, but I am in a bind." "What is it, Nora?" His tone immediately shifted into a familiar register of weary disappointment. "I am reviewing contractor bids for your sister. I do not have time for trivial complaints." "It is my rent," I stammered, pressing my fingernails into my palm to ground myself. "My car needed a new alternator last week, and it drained my checking account. I am short on rent. If I do not have $500 by tomorrow, I am going to incur a severe late penalty. Can you please loan it to me? I will pay you back on the first of the month." The line went silent, save for the hum of the diesel engine. I could almost hear the smug satisfaction blooming in his chest. This was his favorite script. The responsible patriarch fielding requests from his inadequate offspring. $500, Douglas repeated, letting a dry chuckle escape his throat. "You work 60 hours a week staring at spreadsheets, and you cannot manage to keep $500 in your savings account." "It was an unexpected expense, Dad. I just need a bridge loan." "A bridge loan?" he scoffed. "You sound like you are running a Fortune 500 company. You are a data processor, Nora. You type numbers into a computer. Paige is opening a luxury storefront. Do you know how much capital she manages every single day? She negotiates with international suppliers. She understands cash flow. If you possessed a fraction of her business acumen, you would not be begging your father for handouts." Every word felt like a physical strike. He was lecturing me about cash flow while actively spending $250,000 he stole from my name. The sheer hypocrisy threatened to break my composure. I wanted to scream the truth through the receiver. I wanted to tell him the banker showed me the blue ink. I wanted to tell him he was a common thief playing dress-up in a clean flannel shirt, but I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. This was a tactical sacrifice. Humiliation was the price of a flawless ambush. "I know," I whispered, forcing a tearful edge into my voice. "I know I am not like Paige. But please, it is just $500. "The answer is no," Douglas stated, his voice ringing with rigid finality. "I am not going to subsidize your poor planning. Valerie and I agreed long ago. We invest in success. We do not throw good money after bad. Maybe missing a rent payment will teach you some fiscal responsibility. Call your landlord and beg for an extension." He ended the call. The dial tone echoed in my ear. I lowered the phone to my desk. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It worked. The bait was taken. By denying my fabricated request, Douglas solidified his own false sense of security. He now firmly believed I was truly broke, financially illiterate, and incapable of uncovering a complex federal fraud. He would not check the trust account today. He would not call the bank. He would spend the next 48 hours basking in his perceived superiority, oblivious to the guillotine poised directly above his neck. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was the family group chat, a digital space I rarely participated in, but always monitored. Paige sent a new message, accompanied by an exasperated selfie. She sat in the passenger seat of her car, holding a thick binder of paperwork, rolling her eyes for the camera. "These commercial vendors are so paranoid," her message read. "The Italian leather supplier is demanding 3 different background checks and rigid proof of funding before they will deliver the display cases. They act like I am trying to rob them. Ugh. The daily struggles of being a female founder." My mother replied instantly with a string of supportive emojis. "They are just intimidated by a young woman with a vision, sweetheart. Your father will have the bank send over the proof of funding by Friday. Do not let the small-minded people slow you down." I read the exchange twice, marveling at the rich layer of foreshadowing. The vendors were not paranoid. They were conducting standard due diligence. In the world of high-end retail, suppliers do not operate on a handshake and a smile. They operate on verified liquidity. Paige believed her status shielded her from scrutiny. She thought the world would bow to her aesthetic vision just because our parents always had. I set my phone face down on the desk. Friday was exactly when the delayed freeze would hit the system. When those strict vendors attempted to process the final payments for the leather displays, the brass fixtures, and the luxury inventory, they would hit a solid brick wall. The checks would bounce. The wire transfers would fail. The bank would flag every transaction as fraudulent. I opened my lunch bag and pulled out a cold turkey sandwich wrapped in foil. I took a bite, chewing slowly, as I stared at the endless rows of data populating my dual monitors. My reality was a cold desk lunch in a sterile office, grinding through agricultural statistics to earn a modest, honest paycheck. Paige's reality was a delusion of grandeur built on a foundation of stolen wealth, hurtling toward a catastrophic collision with the real world. The psychological toll of enduring my father's mockery still hummed in my veins. Being the family's scapegoat required a unique type of endurance. You had to learn how to absorb insults without reacting. You had to accept that your abusers would never view you clearly. But as I reviewed a complex algorithm projecting the upcoming harvest yields, I realized I no longer craved their validation. I did not want Douglas to respect me. I did not want Valerie to love me. I only wanted my money back. And I wanted them to feel the precise level of devastation they so casually inflicted upon me. I typed another line of code, watching the numbers align perfectly on the screen. The trap was set. The diversion was successful. My parents were distracted by their own arrogance, marching proudly toward the edge of a cliff. I settled into the quiet rhythm of my work, embracing the steady grind. The 48-hour window was closing. The silence would soon end. I just had to wait for the alarm to ring. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and a biting frost covering the Ada County foothills. At exactly 9 o'clock, the digital guillotine dropped. I sat at my workstation in the downtown Boise Tech corridor, staring at the digital clock in the corner of my dual monitor setup. Somewhere, in a secure server room on the other side of town, the 48-hour delay expired. A string of code executed its command. Every checking account, savings, reserve, and commercial credit line bearing my family name locked down tight. The financial freeze was no longer a pending request. It was an active, impenetrable wall. While the banking system effectively severed my parents from their stolen wealth, I picked up my phone and opened a social media application. A notification popped up on my screen, indicating that Paige was broadcasting a live video. I tapped the alert. My sister filled the frame, her face perfectly contoured, wearing a designer silk blouse that cost more than a week of my groceries. She held an iced latte in one hand and used the other to gesture toward the interior of her leased downtown storefront. The space was a monument to unearned luxury. Exposed brick walls contrasted with sleek brass clothing racks. Velvet seating areas occupied the corners. Then she panned the camera to the centerpiece of the room. It was a towering, custom-built champagne wall. The structure stood 8 feet tall, crafted from clear acrylic and adorned with gold leaf lettering that spelled out the name of her boutique. Dozens of crystal flutes rested on the illuminated shelves. "Hey guys!" Paige chirped into the microphone, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile. "I just wanted to give you a sneak peek behind the scenes. Opening a storefront is exhausting, but being a self-made female founder is all about pushing through the obstacles. You have to invest in your vision. This champagne wall, it was a splurge, but curating a luxury experience is paramount." The dramatic irony tasted sweet and sharp in the back of my throat. I watched a young woman brag to hundreds of strangers about her relentless work ethic and her self-made status, knowing full well she stood inside a fragile house of cards. That champagne wall was not a splurge. It was a $5,000 theft. It was purchased with the funds my grandfather intended for my future security. Paige continued her virtual tour, oblivious to the reality crashing down around her parents just a few miles away. She spoke about manifesting success. She gave advice to young women about securing capital through sheer determination. She twirled a strand of blonde hair around her finger, portraying the ultimate picture of independent success. The viewers filling the comments section showered her with praise, calling her an inspiration and a business icon. They did not know the money was gone. Paige did not know the grand opening was doomed. She was dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, holding a crystal flute and asking everyone to admire the view. My desk phone remained silent, but my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the laminate surface of my workstation. The caller identification displayed my father. I let it ring 4 times. I took a deep breath, slowing my heart rate, preparing to enter the next phase of the strategy. I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear. "Nora?" Douglas barked. The booming, authoritative tone he wielded at the celebratory dinner was gone. His voice sounded thin, frantic, and breathless. He sounded like a man who just stepped off a ledge and realized the ground was rushing up to meet him. "Hello, Dad. I am in the middle of running a predictive model. Is everything okay?" "I need your credit card number," he demanded, skipping any pleasantries or explanations. "Read me the primary account number, the expiration date, and the security code on the back, right now." I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, keeping my tone mild and confused. "Why do you need my credit card?" "The bank is experiencing a routing error," Douglas stammered the lie tumbling from his mouth with desperate speed. "A technical glitch locked our main operating accounts. Paige has contractors at the boutique demanding their final payments for the inventory delivery and the custom lighting fixtures. If they do not receive a cleared transaction within the hour, they are going to pull the merchandise and walk off the job. I just need you to bridge a gap for your sister until the bank resolves this clerical issue." The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air. Yesterday, he mocked me for asking for a fabricated rent extension. He lectured me on fiscal responsibility. Today, he demanded I leverage my own hard-earned credit to save a luxury boutique funded by my stolen inheritance. I channeled the persona I established during our previous conversation. I played the role of the helpless, financially illiterate daughter. "Dad, I cannot do that. I told you yesterday my checking account is empty because of my car repairs. My credit limit is small and it is almost maxed out. I do not have the liquid capital to float a commercial construction project." "Just try the card, Nora!" he shouted, the panic fracturing his composed exterior. "Run the transaction. We will reimburse you the moment the system clears." "I thought you and Mom agreed never to subsidize poor planning," I replied, feeding his own cruel words back to him with surgical precision. "You told me you only invest in success. You said throwing good money after bad was a foolish endeavor." Silence stretched across the cellular connection. I could hear his jagged breathing. He recognized his own lecture trapped by the arrogant boundary he set just 24 hours prior. Before he could formulate a response, I heard the rustling of the phone changing hands. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little girl," Valerie hissed into the receiver. My mother dropped her refined garden club persona. The venom in her voice was raw and unfiltered. She operated on a different psychological level than my father. While Douglas used intimidation, Valerie utilized emotional warfare. "Your sister is on the verge of launching a premier lifestyle brand," Valerie stated, her words sharp and calculated. "She is building a legacy for this family. You are sitting in a cubicle playing with spreadsheets. I know you are jealous of her success. I know you resent the fact that she has vision while you have nothing. But trying to sabotage her grand opening by refusing to help your own family is a new low, even for you." Gaslighting is a fascinating defense mechanism. Instead of addressing the crisis, Valerie attempted to rewrite the narrative. She framed my lack of funds as a malicious act of jealousy. She wanted me to feel so small, so guilty, and so desperate for her approval that I would blindly hand over whatever resources I possessed just to prove I was a good daughter. In the past, that tactic would have worked. The old version of me would have apologized, scrambled to find a solution, and drained my own meager savings to appease her wrath. But the old version of me did not know about the forged signature in blue ink. I did not break character. I did not engage her emotional bait. I offered no defense against her accusations. Arguing with an abuser only feeds their delusion. Silence and agreement strip them of their power. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am just a data processor. I do not understand cash flow or commercial vendor relations. I am a bitter failure and I cannot help you. You and Dad will just have to use your superior business acumen to figure this out." "Nora, do not. You dare hang up. This." I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the desk. A profound sense of tranquility washed over my cubicle. I stripped them of their power dynamic by refusing to participate in the drama. They wanted a frantic, emotional daughter they could manipulate. Instead, they hit a concrete wall. They were stranded. The credit lines were frozen. The cash was inaccessible. The contractors standing in that boutique would not accept excuses about clerical errors. Blue-collar workers in Idaho expect to be paid for their labor, and they have no patience for wealthy families bouncing checks. I turned my attention back to the live stream on my monitor. Paige was still smiling, posing next to her $5,000 champagne wall, asking her followers to share the broadcast. She was entirely disconnected from the financial apocalypse detonating around her, but the truth rarely stays hidden for long. The contractors were holding invoices. The bank was holding a fraud alert. The delayed fuse burned down to the wire and the explosion was imminent. I took a sip of my coffee, turning my focus back to my data models, waiting for Paige to finally realize the angel investor funding her dream was actually the architect of her nightmare. The digital clock on my desktop ticked past noon. The tech firm hummed around me, keyboards clattering as analysts discussed harvest yields and irrigation logistics. My personal cell phone lit up again. This time, the caller identification did not show my father or my mother. A rapid succession of text bubbles populated the lock screen. They were from Paige. I picked up the device, expecting a frantic plea for help. Instead, I found a digital barrage of entitlement. The first message was an image. It loaded slowly due to the secure office network, revealing a high-resolution screenshot. It was an invoice from a specialty supplier in Milan. $18,000 for bespoke leather display tables and custom stitching. Stamped across the digital receipt in harsh, undeniable red letters was a transaction error code. Payment declined. Funds unavailable. Routing denied. The text beneath the image read, "What is your problem? Fix this right now." I stared at the glowing pixels. The sheer hostility confused me for a fraction of a second. Why was Paige directing her fury at me? She thought my parents were funding this venture. She should be texting Douglas to fix the routing error. Another message buzzed through, vibrating against my palm. "Dad told me you put a hold on the investor account because you were throwing a tantrum. Release the rest of the funds, Nora. My contractors are threatening to walk out, and you are ruining my aesthetic." A twisted, sickening realization settled deep into my stomach. The puzzle pieces snapped into a horrifying alignment. Douglas and Valerie did not merely hide the theft from me. They lied to Paige. They could not admit to their golden child that they were common thieves financing her dream with stolen cash. To maintain their image as wealthy benefactors and respectable rural elite, they spun a masterful ego-stroking fantasy. They told Paige that I was her silent angel investor. They convinced her that I willingly surrendered my grandfather's trust because I believed in her vision. From the time she was a toddler, our parents shielded Paige from consequence. If she broke a window, the wind did it. If she failed a test, the teacher held a bias. They built a localized reality where Paige acted as a center of gravity and everyone else existed to orbit her desires. It made perfect sense to her that her older, boring data processing sister would recognize her brilliant potential and hand over $250,000. In her mind, she felt entitled to my gratitude. She believed she did me a favor by allowing my boring money to touch her glamorous brand. My thumbs hovered over the glass screen. The delusion was breathtaking. I typed a single question mark and hit send. Her response came instantly. "Do not play dumb. Dad said you transferred the capital into a joint holding account for the boutique, but you retained the admin privileges. He said you froze it this morning because you were jealous of my live stream. Unfreeze it. This is my grand opening week. You are breaching our verbal contract." A verbal contract. My father invented a fictional business arrangement to explain where the sudden influx of cash originated. He painted me as the bitter, erratic, silent partner who sabotaged a business deal out of petty sibling rivalry. It was a genius lie. It insulated him from blame while directing all of Paige's fury squarely onto my shoulders. It also explained why Valerie called me a jealous, bitter failure on the phone 20 minutes ago. They were playing multiple sides of the board, trying to keep their fabricated reality from collapsing under its own weight. I looked around the sterile office, listening to the white noise of the ventilation system. I felt a cold, calculated clarity. The old Nora would have frantically tried to explain the misunderstanding. The old Nora would have panicked at being accused of ruining a family event. I tapped the screen, choosing my words with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "I do not know what Dad told you," I typed, "but there is no joint holding account. There is no verbal contract. I am not your silent partner." I watched the 3 animated dots dance on the screen as she drafted her reply. I pictured her pacing the floor of her unfurnished boutique, surrounded by angry electricians and delivery drivers demanding their paychecks. "Then why is the account locked?" she demanded. "Dad said you controlled the routing numbers." I took a slow breath. It was time to shatter the glass house. "The account is locked because the bank fraud department flagged it," I wrote. "Dad did not ask for my investment. He walked into the branch, forged my signature, and emptied a protected trust fund left to me by Grandpa Elias. Every dollar you spent on that boutique was stolen." The digital silence stretched for a full minute. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head, fighting to reject information that threatened her worldview. To accept my text meant accepting that her parents were felons, and her self-made founder status was a criminal illusion. Her next message arrived in a chaotic flurry of typos. "You are lying. You are just trying to ruin my life because you are stuck in a cubicle. Dad would never do that. You gave me that money. You are just having buyer's remorse because my brand is taking off." The psychological armor she wore proved incredibly dense. She genuinely believed her own hype. She preferred to believe I was a vindictive liar rather than confront the reality that her entire existence relied on fraud. She could not process the concept of failure, let alone complicity in a grand larceny scheme. She sent another message. "I am standing here with vendors who need to be paid. Release the funds right now or I am taking legal action. I will sue you for disruption of business." A short, dry laugh escaped my lips. The irony felt poetic. She threatened to sue the person she unknowingly robbed. She wanted to enforce a fictional verbal contract to compel a theft victim to continue funding her champagne wall. She stood in a leased commercial space obtained through wire fraud, threatening to drag me into a courtroom. I did not feel anger. I felt the profound, chilling peace of a person watching a building demolish itself from the inside. I positioned my fingers over the digital keyboard and delivered the final, undeniable truth. You cannot sue an investor who never invested, Paige. And you cannot spend money that belongs to a locked trust. Tell the contractors to pack up their tools. Tell the leather suppliers to cancel the delivery. I am not your investor, Paige. I am your debt collector, and I am coming for every single cent. I hit send. I did not wait for her erratic response. I pressed the power button on the side of the device, turning the screen black and tossing it into my desk drawer. The narrative shift reached its conclusion. The parents' web of lies entangled their golden child, creating a relentless, accelerating disaster. Paige remained trapped in a boutique with angry creditors armed with nothing but false promises and a dead-end narrative. She would spend the next hour screaming at delivery drivers, waving a dead cell phone, demanding respect she never earned. I turned back to my dual monitors. The numbers on my spreadsheet aligned in perfect rows, obedient and rational. The financial squeeze achieved its purpose. The pressure reached a boiling point. While Paige threw a tantrum in a dark storefront, I knew exactly where Douglas was heading next. A man whose ego ties directly to his wealth cannot tolerate a frozen bank account. A man who relies on his reputation will stop at nothing to unlock the vault. Douglas would not accept defeat over the phone. He would not hide in his farmhouse. He would demand a face-to-face resolution. He would put on his heavy work boots, climb into his pristine truck, and drive straight downtown to intimidate the bank manager in person. He marched directly into the center of the trap I laid at First Heritage Financial. The ticking clock ran out. The public collision approached with the unstoppable force of a freight train. My desk phone remained silent, but my imagination painted the scene unfolding downtown with absolute clarity. I knew my father. I knew the precise sequence of his anger. Douglas Bennett did not do patience. When he faced a locked door, he did not look for a key. He simply assumed he owned the building and commanded the hinges to yield. I pictured his oversized luxury truck jumping the curb outside First Heritage Financial. He would leave the engine running, a brazen display of his perceived importance in our agricultural community. He would push through the heavy glass doors, bringing the scent of diesel and unearned arrogance into the sterile, climate-controlled lobby. He would bypass the velvet ropes. He would ignore the tellers. He believed waiting in line was a penalty reserved for the lower class. I glanced at my cellular device resting on the laminate desk. The screen remained dark. The trap was springing, and I had a front row seat secured by a prearranged phone call. I asked Jonathan Wallace to leave his desk phone off the hook when my father arrived. I wanted to hear the exact moment the rural patriarch shattered. Right on schedule, my office line blinked. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear, holding my breath. The audio quality was slightly muffled, but the booming baritone of my father echoed through the connection. He barged into the branch manager office without knocking. He demanded to know why his operating capital was frozen. He used words like unacceptable and clerical incompetence. He dropped the names of city council members and regional agricultural board directors, wielding his social network like a bludgeon. He demanded Wallace override the system and wire the funds to Page contractors immediately. He leaned over the mahogany desk, attempting to physically intimidate the seasoned banker. But Jonathan Wallace did not cower. Yesterday, the manager was terrified of institutional liability. Today, armed with my legal directives and the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud, Wallace possessed all the leverage. I listened as Wallace calmly asked my father to take a seat. Douglas refused, stating he did not have time to sit while his daughter was being stalled by bureaucratic nonsense. The rustle of heavy paper translated through the telephone speaker. I knew exactly what Wallace was pulling from his drawer. The manager did not offer apologies. He did not offer technical excuses. He simply slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood surface. He informed Douglas that the accounts were not experiencing a routing error. He stated the assets were locked under a mandatory federal fraud investigation protocol. My father scoffed a harsh, abrasive sound. He asked what kind of ridiculous fraud the bank was chasing. He claimed his accounts were pristine. He boasted about his credit rating. Then Wallace presented the withdrawal authorization form. He laid it flat on the desk. He tapped his index finger against the bottom line. He told my father that the $250,000 transfer initiating the boutique funding required a notarized signature from the legal beneficiary. He stated that the beneficiary, Nora Bennett, visited the branch yesterday and confirmed she never signed the document. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The blustering bravado instantly evaporated from my father. He stammered, attempting to construct a defense. He claimed I was confused. He suggested I must have forgotten signing the authorization during a family meeting. He tried to gaslight the bank manager, spinning a narrative where I was an unstable, forgetful daughter prone to dramatic outbursts. Wallace cut him off. The manager pointed to the specific indentation on the paper. He noted the heavy, aggressive pressure of the pen strokes, completely inconsistent with my handwriting profile on file. And then Wallace delivered the fatal blow. He mentioned the ink. He stated the document was signed using a highly unique custom indigo ink cartridge. I heard a sharp, desperate scuffing noise through the receiver. It was the sound of my father, heavy leather work boots scraping violently against the pristine marble floor as he stumbled backward. His physical equilibrium failed him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Wallace pointed directly at the flannel shirt pocket on my father. He pointed at the heavy brass pen sticking out of the fabric. The 20-year anniversary gift, the only pen Douglas ever used. The weapon he wielded to steal my future. My father realized he was not arguing with a subordinate bank teller. He was standing in a room with a man holding irrefutable proof of a felony. The bank manager coldly informed him that the $250,000 was now legally classified as stolen capital. Douglas owed me the full amount, and the bank was required by federal law to report the forged wire transfer to the authorities. The facade broke. The respectable Idaho farmer, the pillar of the conservative community, the man who measured human worth in dollars, completely collapsed. He sounded small, weak, and terrified. He asked Wallace what he was supposed to do. He begged the manager to keep the situation quiet, offering to quietly repay the money over time to avoid a scandal. Wallace flatly refused, stating the legal freeze was permanent until my attorneys provided further instructions. I gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle, severing the connection. I did not need to hear him beg. I had heard enough. The catharsis washed over me in a profound, freezing wave. For 28 years, I lived under his thumb. I absorbed his mockery, accepted his dismissals, and allowed him to dictate my value. In less than 10 minutes, I dismantled his entire universe using nothing but his own arrogance and a paper trail. My personal cell phone immediately began to vibrate across the desk. The caller identification flashed with my father name. I watched the screen glow, illuminating the sterile office environment. The device buzzed relentlessly, vibrating against the laminate surface. When the call went to voicemail, another one came through instantly. This time, it was my mother. Valerie was undoubtedly calling from the farmhouse, panicked and screaming, realizing her pristine social standing was about to be incinerated. I ignored every single call. I turned the ringer off and placed the device face down. The power dynamic officially flipped. I was no longer the invisible workhorse they could exploit. I was the architect of their ruin. They were fighting for survival, desperately scrambling to patch a sinking ship while the ocean rushed in. Douglas would have to leave that bank lobby and drive back to his farmhouse, knowing he faced prison time. Valerie would have to face the reality that her country club friends would soon read about her husband in the local police blotter. Paige was trapped in a dark boutique with unpaid contractors. I picked up my cold cup of coffee and took a long sip. The bitter liquid tasted like absolute victory. The legal boundaries I established proved merciless and efficient. No amount of parental guilt-tripping or toxic family entitlement could override the rigid, unforgiving nature of a federal bank fraud investigation. I returned to my data spreadsheets, typing commands with steady, unshakable hands. I won the war. I secured my boundaries. I just needed to wait for the authorities to finish the job. But the feeling of triumph was brutally interrupted. A young woman from the corporate mailroom walked into my cubicle holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. She asked me to sign for a certified parcel. I took the clipboard, scribbled my name, and accepted the package. The return address belonged to a prominent commercial real estate group based in downtown Boise. I reached into my drawer for a letter opener, slicing the heavy cardboard. I pulled out a towering stack of legal documents. I scanned the first page, expecting a simple notification about my own apartment building. Instead, my eyes locked onto a commercial lease agreement for a luxury retail space. The exact retail space my sister currently occupied. And sitting on the bottom line, underneath a mountain of financial liability, was my Social Security number. The heavy cardboard mailer sat on my desk like a live explosive. My eyes scanned the bold header printed at the top of the crisp white page. It was a commercial lease agreement from Vanguard Property Management, the largest real estate conglomerate in downtown Boise. The document outlined the terms for a premium, high-visibility retail storefront. It was the exact address where my sister currently stood, surrounded by unpaid contractors and a useless champagne wall. I flipped past the architectural addendums and the zoning disclosures, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached the financial obligations section. The numbers printed in bold black ink were staggering. The lease carried a 60-month term. The base rent was listed at $8,000 per month, plus triple net expenses, covering property taxes, building insurance, and structural maintenance. The total aggregate liability over the 5-year period exceeded $500,000. My hands began to shake as I turned to the final signature page. There were 3 designated sections. The first belonged to the property manager. The second belonged to the tenant, bearing the looping, practiced signature of my sister Paige. The third section was designated for the personal guarantor. A personal guarantor is required when a commercial tenant lacks the credit history or the liquid assets to secure a high-risk lease on their own. The guarantor assumes absolute financial responsibility if the primary tenant defaults. If the business fails, the landlord bypasses the bankrupt tenant and legally pursues the guarantor for the entire remaining balance of the contract. Sitting on the line designated for the personal guarantor was my printed name, my home address, and my complete Social Security number. Just beneath that sensitive data was a signature. I leaned in close, examining the ink. The heavy, aggressive indentations carved deep grooves into the thick paper. The color was unmistakable. It was the exact same rich, custom indigo blue ink from the heavy brass anniversary pen my father always carried in his flannel shirt pocket. The scope of my father's betrayal expanded with horrifying clarity. He did not merely empty my grandfather's trust fund to steal $250,000 in cash. He committed systemic, calculated identity theft. Douglas knew Page possessed zero credit history. He knew a corporate property management firm would never hand the keys to a prime downtown location to a 24-year-old influencer with no tangible assets or proven revenue streams. Douglas needed a pristine credit profile to secure the storefront. He possessed his own wealth, but he absolutely refused to risk his own agricultural land or his personal liquid assets on a risky retail venture. He wanted the prestige of being the generous patriarch without shouldering any of the actual financial liability, so he served me up on a silver platter. He leveraged my impeccable credit score, my steady employment history, and my stolen identity to build a protective financial buffer between his golden child and the real world. A wave of nausea washed over me as the devastating irony of the situation settled into my bones. I had spent the morning engineering a flawless financial freeze. I locked down the stolen trust money to stop Paige from launching her boutique. By successfully freezing those accounts, I guaranteed that her business would fail before it even opened its doors. By ensuring the boutique failed, I inadvertently triggered the default clauses buried in this commercial lease. When the rent checks bounced next week, the property management firm would not pursue Paige. They would look at the guarantor agreement. They would see my Social Security number. They would come after me for $500,000. They would garnish my wages from the agricultural tech firm. They would place a lien on my bank accounts. They would obliterate my credit score, effectively destroying my ability to ever purchase a home, secure a vehicle, or build a life of my own. My father had secretly chained me to the hull of a sinking ship, and I had just gleefully blown a hole in the bottom of the boat. The quiet, calculated trap I laid at the bank was no longer sufficient. I was no longer playing a passive game of financial defense. I was no longer just a victim trying to recover stolen cash. I was a casualty, standing on the front lines of an active war for my fundamental survival. I shoved the 50-page lease agreement back into the cardboard mailer. I shut down my dual monitors and packed my briefcase. I walked down the hall to my supervisor, maintaining a mask of total professional composure. I informed him that an urgent family medical emergency required my immediate attention, and I needed to take the rest of the week off. He approved the absence without hesitation. I did not drive back to my modest apartment. I drove directly toward the towering glass buildings of the Boise Legal District. I did not need a friendly family practice attorney who mediated gentle divorces or drafted polite wills. I needed a predator. I needed a corporate litigator who viewed the legal system as a battlefield. Through my network at the tech firm, I had heard whispers of a partner at a high-profile law firm known for dismantling corporate opponents with ruthless efficiency. His name was Victor Thorne. He was expensive, aggressive, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. I walked into his firm, bypassed the receptionist, and demanded an emergency consultation, stating I had the capital to pay his premium retainer up front. Within 20 minutes, I was seated in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victor Thorne walked in, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. He sat across from me, his demeanor cold and analytical. I did not waste time with emotional anecdotes about my childhood. I opened my briefcase and laid the evidence on the glass table. I presented the IRS audit notification displaying the stolen trust funds. I presented the bank withdrawal authorization featuring the forged indigo ink. Finally, I slid the certified commercial lease agreement across the table, pointing to my stolen Social Security number. I explained the timeline. I explained the financial freeze currently suffocating my parents. I told him my father committed federal wire fraud and systemic identity theft to fund a retail business that was actively imploding as we spoke. Thorne reviewed the documents in absolute silence. He traced the indentations of the forged signatures. He read the personal guarantor clauses. When he finally looked up at me, a sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He told me my father had constructed a magnificent legal snare, but he made the fatal mistake of leaving his fingerprints all over the mechanism. Thorne explained that we were not going to mount a defense against the commercial landlord. We were going to go on the offensive, utilizing the full weight of the federal legal system to completely crush Douglas Bennett. Thorne outlined the strategy. First, we would immediately file a formal police report for identity theft and wire fraud, generating an official criminal complaint. Second, Thorne would draft an aggressive legal notice to Vanguard Property Management, informing them that their commercial lease was secured through criminal forgery. We would demand my name be immediately severed from the contract, transferring the entire $500,000 liability squarely onto the shoulders of the person who actually signed the document. We would back my father into a corner where he had to either assume the massive debt personally or face immediate federal indictment. I authorized Thorne to execute the plan. I signed the retainer agreement, officially transforming my private family conflict into a blazing legal war against my own blood. As Thorne's legal team began drafting the cease and desist orders and the criminal affidavits, I walked out of the law firm feeling a renewed sense of lethal determination. The stakes were multiplied, but so was my resolve. I was no longer the quiet sister sitting in the shadows. I was the architect of their ruin. The legal machinery was now activated. In a matter of hours, couriers would arrive at my parents' immaculate farmhouse, delivering formal threats of prosecution. The realization that they were no longer dealing with a compliant daughter, but with a ruthless corporate litigator, would push them past the point of panic. It would drive them into absolute, blinding desperation. They would realize the banking freeze was merely the opening salvo, and knowing my mother, that level of desperation would force her to abandon her country club decorum. She would not wait for the lawyers. She would seek me out. She would attempt one final manipulative ambush to save her husband from prison and her golden child from public humiliation. I drove back to my apartment, locked my door, and prepared myself for the emotional warfare I knew was coming straight to my doorstep. I sat on the faded gray sofa inside my living room, watching the evening sun dip below the Boise skyline. The residence was quiet, functioning as a sanctuary I funded through my own relentless labor. No security buzzer rang to announce an arrival. Someone had bypassed the main exterior gate of the complex. A sharp, rapid knocking echoed against my front door. The frantic rhythm betrayed the identity of the visitor before I even turned the brass handle. I knew exactly who stood on the other side. Opening the wooden barrier, I discovered Valerie Bennett. My mother appeared entirely unraveled, a stark departure from her usual manicured perfection. Her typically pristine blonde hair looked windswept and chaotic strands sticking to her damp forehead. The tailored cashmere sweaters she normally favored were replaced by a wrinkled beige trench coat that hung awkwardly on her frame. She clutched a plastic bakery container in her trembling hands. Pushing past my shoulder without waiting for an invitation, she stepped aggressively into my modest hallway. She shoved the transparent plastic container onto my kitchen counter. The fragile lid was crushed, caved inward from careless handling. Inside sat a half-dozen bruised, cheap grocery store blueberry muffins. Artificial syrup bled onto the surrounding plastic, creating a sticky, pathetic mess. This represented her peace offering. After assisting my father in stealing $250,000 and forging my identity to secure a massive commercial lease, my mother genuinely believed a smashed $4 baked good would mend the catastrophic damage. The sheer insult of the bribe felt almost heavier than the financial theft itself. It demonstrated exactly how little she valued my intelligence. Valerie immediately began to weep. It was a practiced, highly theatrical display of maternal sorrow. She collapsed onto one of my wooden dining chairs, covering her face with both palms. She sobbed about the legal couriers who descended upon their farmhouse earlier that afternoon. Victor Thorne, my newly retained corporate litigator, worked with terrifying speed. The formal cease and desist orders, along with the criminal fraud notifications, successfully breached their rural fortress. The illusion of their untouchable rural elite status evaporated the moment those couriers handed Douglas the thick legal envelopes. Unzipping her designer leather handbag, she produced a single crumpled sheet of paper. She smoothed the creases with shaking fingers and slid the document across the table, positioning it right next to the ruined muffins. It was a typed form, hastily drafted, and heavily littered with dense legal jargon. I recognized it immediately as a retroactive consent waiver. The text explicitly stated that I, Nora Bennett, fully authorized the liquidation of the grandfather trust and willingly co-signed the Vanguard Property Management commercial lease. The date printed at the top was intentionally backdated by 3 full months. She begged me to sign the forgery. Her voice cracked as she claimed Douglas would face a federal judge and a lengthy prison sentence if I refused to cooperate. She painted a vivid picture of absolute family ruin, detailing the social humiliation they would endure within their conservative church circle. Throughout her entire adult life, Valerie operated as the ultimate enabler. She constructed her core identity around being the flawless wife to a wealthy agricultural patriarch. Whenever Douglas demanded compliance, she provided it without hesitation, frequently offering me up as the sacrificial lamb to maintain their domestic tranquility. She fully expected me to lay down on the altar one final time to protect her manicured reality. I stared at the backdated document, then shifted my gaze to her tear-stained face. I maintained total composure, informing her that I would never sign a retroactive confession to a crime I did not commit. I refused to absorb their felony. The tears vanished instantly. The weeping, desperate mother transformed into a cornered, vicious predator in the blink of an eye. Valerie stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. Her voice dropped to a venomous hiss. Since guilt failed to manipulate my actions, she pivoted directly to intimidation. She threatened to call the Human Resources Department at my agricultural tech firm first thing tomorrow morning. She promised to tell my corporate supervisors that I orchestrated an elaborate, malicious family scam to extort money from my aging parents. She vowed to completely annihilate my professional reputation, ensuring I would lose my data analytics career and face industry-wide blacklisting. The psychological weight of her threat hung heavily in the stagnant air of the apartment. A younger, weaker version of myself might have folded under that intense, aggressive maternal pressure. The childhood instinct to shrink to apologize and to appease the abuser ran deep in my veins. Instead, I felt a sudden surge of profound, unshakable power. I realized her threats held zero actual leverage. My career was built on tangible, measurable results, not nepotism or social manipulation. Victor Thorne already possessed the irrefutable evidence of their forgery. Her blackmail attempt was entirely hollow. I picked up the backdated consent form from the countertop. Grasping the edges firmly, I tore the paper directly down the middle. I ripped it again, letting the shredded pieces flutter onto the kitchen floor like dead leaves. I looked her directly in the eyes, executing a perfect refusal to shrink. I quoted the exact cruel words she threw at me during that celebratory champagne dinner weeks ago. If I had actually done something with my life, Mom, you and Dad would not have needed to forge my signature to save your golden child. Valerie gasped, stepping backward as if physically struck by the sheer force of my boundaries. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The realization finally dawned on her. The obedient scapegoat was dead. The cycle of abuse ended the exact moment the chosen victim refused to play along with the delusion. I walked purposefully over to the front door and pulled it wide open, gesturing toward the exterior hallway. I commanded her to leave my home immediately. I stated with absolute icy clarity that any future communication must be routed exclusively through my attorney. I informed her that she and Douglas were going to repay every single stolen dollar, assume full liability for the fraudulent commercial lease, and face the severe federal consequences of their blinding arrogance. She stumbled out of the residence, her face pale, completely stripped of her manipulative power. I slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the deadbolt until it clicked into place with a satisfying metallic finality. The perimeter was secured. The legal trap was locked tighter than a steel vault. However, the explosive fallout from their crimes was far from finished. Tomorrow was Friday. The morning sun would bring the highly publicized, heavily marketed grand opening of Paige's luxury lifestyle boutique. My delusional sister was about to walk into a downtown storefront, possessing absolutely zero funding, a fraudulent commercial lease actively under criminal review, and a massive crowd of furious, unpaid creditors waiting at the glass entrance. The foundation of her stolen empire was rigged to detonate, and I planned to watch the entire structure collapse. Friday morning dawned over the Boise skyline, painting the distant foothills in a wash of pale gold. Inside my apartment, the atmosphere felt remarkably serene. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling my modest kitchen. For the first time in my entire adult life, I woke up without the crushing weight of my family hovering over my consciousness. The deadbolt on my front door remained securely locked. My newly retained corporate litigator was handling the legal warfare. My primary objective for the day required zero professional exertion. I merely needed to sit at my kitchen island, open my personal laptop, and witness the inevitable consequences of blinding entitlement colliding with absolute reality. Today marked the highly publicized, heavily marketed grand opening of my sister luxury lifestyle brand. Paige had spent the previous 6 months hyping this exact date across every major digital platform. Her thousands of social media followers expected a magnificent spectacle of high-end retail. They anticipated browsing imported Italian leather goods, sipping premium beverages, and basking in the curated aesthetic of a self-proclaimed entrepreneurial genius. I navigated to her public profile and clicked on the glowing icon indicating an active live broadcast. The video feed loaded instantly. Paige filled the screen standing near the entrance of her downtown commercial space. She wore a pristine white designer suit, a garment she undoubtedly purchased on credit before my financial freeze decimated their accounts. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, but the high-definition camera captured the stark, undeniable exhaustion hiding beneath her heavy makeup. Her eyes darted nervously off-screen. Her signature bright smile looked brittle, strained by the monumental effort required to maintain her fabricated illusion. "Welcome, everyone," Paige announced, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "Thank you so much for tuning in to the official launch. The energy in here is just absolutely incredible. The energy she described was entirely fictitious. The camera panned slowly across the interior of the storefront, revealing a scene of staggering desolation. The luxury boutique was shockingly barren. Instead of racks overflowing with exclusive garments and shelves lined with premium accessories, the room featured acres of empty, polished hardwood flooring. The Italian leather display tables, which were supposed to be delivered yesterday, never arrived because the vendor payment bounced. The custom mannequins were absent. Then the camera inadvertently captured the primary checkout counter, delivering a visual metaphor so perfectly tragic it felt scripted. Resting on the polished brass surface was a solitary, depressing plastic tray of stale grocery store cupcakes. They possessed the exact same cheap artificial blue frosting as the ruined muffins Valerie brought to my apartment during her failed blackmail attempt yesterday. Sitting directly adjacent to that pathetic bakery tray was a formidable fixed stack of printed vendor invoices. The urgent past due stamps stamped across the paperwork were clearly visible, demanding payments that would never materialize. Paige quickly turned the camera back to her own face, attempting to spin the catastrophic failure into a deliberate branding strategy. As you can see, she spoke rapidly, her words tripping over one another. We decided to pivot at the very last minute. We are adopting an ultra-exclusive, hyper-minimalist approach for our debut. True luxury is about empty space. It is about anticipation. Our initial capsule collection is currently secured in a secondary warehouse due to overwhelming demand and some minor supply chain delays. But this space represents the sheer potential of our brand vision. I watched the live comment section scrolling rapidly along the bottom of the screen. Her digital audience possessed more intelligence than she anticipated. Viewers immediately began questioning the narrative. "Where are the clothes?" one user typed. "Did she just open an empty room?" another asked. "Those are supermarket cupcakes on the counter," a third person observed. Paige ignored the scrolling criticism, desperately attempting to project an aura of unbothered success. She continued her monologue, speaking about manifesting destiny and overcoming the jealousy of small-minded people. She constructed a fantasy over a gaping void, entirely convinced she could talk her way out of bankruptcy. Suddenly, the heavy glass front door of the shop chimed loudly. Paige brightened, relief flashing across her features. She aimed the camera toward the entrance, eager to showcase her very first eager patron. "Oh my goodness! Our first official client is walking through the door right now!" The man stepping into the retail space did not fit her curated demographic. He was a local tradesman, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket, stained denim pants, and a thick leather tool belt slung across his waist. He possessed the rugged, callous demeanor of a man who worked hard for his income and harbored zero patience for wealthy individuals who failed to honor their debts. I recognized the company logo embroidered on his jacket from the background of Paige's earlier promotional videos. He was the primary electrical contractor hired to install the custom track lighting and the illuminated champagne wall. He did not care about the live broadcast. He did not care about her aesthetic vision. He cared about his uncashed paycheck. "Are you Paige Bennett?" the tradesman demanded, his voice carrying a booming, authoritative volume that echoed off the bare walls of the empty shop. Paige lowered her phone slightly, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "Yes, but I am currently conducting a live press event. If you could please step outside, my father will call your office this afternoon to resolve the clerical error with your invoice." "There is no clerical error, lady," the electrician countered, taking a heavy step forward into the center of the room. "My bank called me an hour ago. The wire transfer your father authorized yesterday bounced. The teller told me the routing account is locked down for fraudulent activity. You owe my crew $12,000 for labor and materials, and I am not leaving this building until I have a certified cashier check in my hand." The comments section on the live stream exploded into a frenzy of digital shock and amusement. The illusion of the wealthy self-made female founder shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. Thousands of viewers watched a working-class tradesman publicly expose her fraudulent foundation. Paige scrambled backward, her hands shaking violently as she clutched her phone. "You cannot be here. You are trespassing. You are disrupting my business." "You do not have a business," the contractor replied, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "You have an empty room and a stolen bank account." He turned his back on her frantic protests. He marched directly past the brass checkout counter, ignoring the stale cupcakes and the mountain of invoices. He walked straight toward the main electrical breaker box mounted on the rear wall, located just behind the towering, unpaid champagne structure. "If you cannot pay for the lighting," the tradesman declared, reaching for the heavy steel panel, "then you do not get to use the lighting." He threw the master switches. A loud, heavy clank resonated through the storefront. The entire boutique plunged into deep shadow. The overhead track lights died instantly. The custom illumination behind the acrylic champagne shelves faded to black. The glowing neon sign displaying her brand name flickered and extinguished. The only illumination remaining was the dull gray morning light filtering weakly through the front display windows, casting long, depressing shadows across the barren hardwood floors. Paige let out a sharp, genuine cry of despair. The screen went completely dark as she abruptly terminated the live feed. I closed my laptop. The sudden silence of my apartment wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I sat at my kitchen island, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the moment. I searched my chest for any trace of petty euphoria, but I found none. Instead, I experienced a profound, heavy mixture of pity and absolute, cold closure. I did not actively destroy my sister. I did not drive down to her commercial property and smash her windows. I did not log into her social media account and post malicious rumors. I simply removed the stolen financial foundation holding her empire aloft, and basic gravity accomplished the rest. Her dream collapsed under the weight of its own criminal architecture. She believed her unearned privilege shielded her from consequence, but reality proved far more resilient than her delusion. The grand opening disaster served as the ultimate reality-based payoff, but the implosion was far from over. The failed launch represented merely the opening skirmish in a much larger incoming war. While Paige stood crying in the dark, the corporate gears of downtown Boise continued to turn. Vanguard Property Management received Victor Thorne aggressive legal notice this morning. The massive commercial lease keeping Paige legally tied to that dark, empty room was officially under criminal review for identity theft. The financial pressure surrounding my family had nowhere left to expand externally. They could no longer siphon resources from my future. They were trapped together inside a burning building of their own design. When toxic individuals exhaust their supply of external victims, they invariably turn their rage upon each other. My cell phone vibrated on the counter, displaying a text message from a mutual acquaintance who worked at a coffee shop across the street from the boutique. The message indicated that Douglas and Valerie had just arrived at the storefront, and a vicious, screaming argument was currently erupting in the parking lot. The unified family facade was fracturing, and the inevitable toxic explosion was about to tear them all apart. The text message arrived on my phone just before 11 o'clock in the morning. It contained a video file accompanied by a brief message from a former coworker named Zara. Zara currently managed a high-end coffee franchise located directly across the street from my sister's dark, lifeless commercial storefront. The message simply read that I might want to see what was happening outside her shop. I sat on my comfortable gray sofa, completely insulated from the biting Idaho wind, and tapped the screen to play the recording. The shaky camera phone footage framed the expansive, manicured parking lot of the downtown retail district. The video captured my father's oversized luxury truck parked diagonally across two spaces. Douglas and Valerie Bennett stood on the pristine concrete. They were facing their youngest daughter. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, picking up the sharp, frantic echoes of their voices bouncing off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. I watched the golden child of our conservative family finally bare her true teeth. For 24 years, my parents insulated Paige from every conceivable consequence. They curated an existence where she never had to experience failure, delay, or accountability. If she performed poorly in a high school equestrian competition, my father bought a more expensive horse. If she overspent her allowance, my mother secretly transferred funds from the grocery budget to cover the deficit. They essentially trained a predator, teaching her that her desires superseded all moral and legal boundaries. They believed this unwavering financial devotion would purchase her eternal loyalty and affection. The video playing on my device proved how catastrophic that calculation truly was. Paige paced back and forth in front of her parents, her pristine white designer suit looking absurd against the backdrop of her failed storefront. Her face, usually composed for digital audiences, was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She was not crying out of remorse. She was not expressing horror that her parents committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to fund her lifestyle. She was furious because they were stupid enough to get caught. "You promised me this was handled," Paige screamed, jabbing a manicured finger directly toward my father's face. "You told me Nora surrendered the trust. You told me the lease was clean. Now I have electricians shutting off my power on a live broadcast. Do you have any idea what you have done to my personal brand?" Douglas attempted to utilize his booming, patriarchal voice, the same tone he used to dominate local agricultural board meetings and intimidate bank managers. He commanded her to lower her voice and get inside the truck so they could discuss the matter privately. He ordered her to stop causing a public spectacle, but Douglas possessed a fatal flaw in his logic. His authority only existed because he held the purse strings. He controlled our family through financial intimidation. Now his bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators. His credit cards were declined. He faced a massive criminal liability and the impending loss of his personal liberty. He had no money left to leverage. Paige recognized his sudden weakness instantly. She did not lower her voice. She escalated. "I am not getting in your truck!" she shrieked, throwing her arms wide. "You are broke. You are going to prison. My vendors are filing lawsuits against my company right now because you lied to me. You completely ruined my life." Valerie stepped forward, attempting to deploy her usual emotional manipulation. My mother spent her entire adult life curating Paige to be the perfect reflection of her own social aspirations. Valerie endured my father's suffocating control because she believed Paige would validate her sacrifices by succeeding in high society. Valerie reached out her hands, trembling, trying to pull Paige into a maternal embrace. She pleaded with her daughter to remember that they did all of this out of love. She cried, begging Paige to stand together as a family during this crisis. Paige violently slapped my mother's hands away. The physical rejection was so forceful it caused Valerie to stumble backward on the concrete. "Do not touch me," Paige snarled. "You are both pathetic. You dragged me into a felony. I am the victim here. I am the one who has to show my face in this town while everyone laughs at my empty store." A profound, sickening realization washed over Valerie's face in the video. The camera captured the exact second her carefully constructed delusion shattered. For decades, Valerie willingly sacrificed me. She permitted my emotional abuse, participated in my financial ruin, and called me a bitter failure, all to protect her beautiful, perfect younger daughter. She believed that devotion secured a sacred, unbreakable bond. In that parking lot, Valerie realized a fundamental psychological truth. A parasite does not love its host. It merely feeds until the host is empty, and then it becomes angry that the food supply stopped. Paige possessed absolutely zero loyalty to the woman who raised her. She only loved the convenience and the luxury her parents provided. Now that the luxury was gone, Paige viewed her parents as nothing more than useless, embarrassing liabilities. Douglas stepped between them, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at Paige, reminding her of the sacrifices he made. He yelled that he risked everything, his reputation, his legacy, and his freedom, just to give her that boutique. He demanded respect. He demanded she acknowledge the magnitude of what he surrendered for her dream. Paige reached into the pocket of her white blazer. She pulled out the heavy ring of brass keys belonging to the leased commercial storefront, the same lease containing my forged Social Security number. She did not hand them back to him. She reared her arm back and hurled the heavy metal keys directly at my father's chest. They struck him hard against his collarbone with a loud metallic smack before clattering onto the asphalt. Douglas recoiled, his hand flying up to his chest in pure shock. The patriarch of the Bennett family, a man who built an entire identity around unyielding respect and rugged authority, stood humiliated in a public square. He stared down at the keys resting near his expensive leather work boots. He had absolutely no response. His power was gone. "Keep the store," Paige spat, turning her back on both of them. "It is worthless anyway." She marched away toward her own vehicle, leaving her parents standing alone in the cold morning air. Valerie dropped her face into her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent, uncontrolled sobs. Her golden child abandoned her at the very first sign of adversity. Douglas simply stood frozen, a broken king surveying his ruined kingdom. The video clip ended. My screen went black. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter. I felt no urge to call them. I felt no desire to gloat or insert myself into the wreckage. I maintained my strict, impenetrable wall of no contact. Toxic family systems require a designated scapegoat to function. They need a receptacle for their anxiety, a target for their blame, and a foundation to exploit. The scapegoat stabilizes the dysfunction by absorbing the poison, allowing the abusers and the golden child to maintain their twisted harmony. When you remove the scapegoat from the equation, the system loses its shock absorber. The poison has nowhere else to go. The abusers and the enablers are forced to look at each other. They are forced to confront their own ugly reflections. Without me there to blame, without my money to spend, and without my identity to steal, my parents and my sister had no choice but to devour one another. I did not have to lift a finger to punish them. I merely became the architect of the rigid boundaries that forced them to destroy themselves. I deleted the video file from my device. I poured the remainder of my coffee down the sink and prepared to log in for my afternoon shift at the data analytics firm. I possessed a life to live, a career to build, and a future that belonged entirely to me. However, the consequences of that morning were far from contained. Boise is a rapidly growing metropolitan area, but at its core, it still operates like a tight-knit rural community. The people who frequent that downtown coffee shop overlap significantly with the affluent circles my parents desperately try to impress. Business owners talk. Tradesmen gossip. The angry electrical contractor who shut down the boutique was already spreading the word about the frozen bank accounts and the bounced checks. The public screaming match in the parking lot served as a massive flare fired directly into the sky. The carefully maintained facade of the respectable, wealthy Bennett family was publicly and violently stripped away. The truth was currently racing through the country club locker rooms and the local neighborhood group texts. Tomorrow was Sunday. My parents would have to walk into their conservative, appearance-obsessed church congregation. They would have to face the extended family members who previously nodded along to their lies and praised Paige for her fictitious brilliance. The legal war was safely in the hands of my attorney, but the social reckoning was just beginning. The community was about to discover they were shaking hands with thieves, and the resulting silence would be deafening. Sunday mornings in our conservative Idaho community operated as a highly choreographed performance. The local congregation served as the ultimate arena for displaying social currency. The sanctuary was populated by wealthy agricultural landowners, prominent real estate developers, and local politicians who treated the weekly service less like a spiritual gathering and more like a mandatory networking event. Status in this ecosystem was entirely dependent on outward appearances. You were judged by the model of the vehicle you parked in the paved lot, the tailored cut of your Sunday garments, and the carefully curated success stories you shared about your children during the post-service coffee hour. For nearly 3 decades, my parents occupied a position of absolute privilege within this hierarchy. Douglas Bennett was revered as a pillar of traditional values, a man who expanded his generational farming acreage through sheer willpower. Valerie Bennett reigned as a matriarch of domestic perfection, hosting charity luncheons and organizing holiday drives. They utilized my sister as their prized exhibit, consistently boasting about Paige and her glamorous aspirations, while conveniently omitting my existence from every public conversation. The extended family members, aunts, uncles, and second cousins, who filled 3 entire pews near the front of the church, willingly participated in this dynamic. They eagerly absorbed my mother's fabricated narratives, nodding sympathetically whenever Valerie sighed and murmured vague, pitying statements about my inability to match my siblings' extraordinary potential. But social currency is incredibly fragile when it is backed by nothing but stolen capital. The explosive public screaming match in the downtown parking lot yesterday acted as a catalyst, completely destroying the vacuum seal on our family secrets. The angry electrical contractor who plunged the boutique into darkness possessed deep roots in our community. His wife sang in the church choir. His brother served on the neighborhood zoning board. By Saturday evening, the news of the bounced wire transfers, the forged signatures, and the impending federal fraud investigation had thoroughly saturated the local gossip network. I did not attend the service that morning. I remained safely inside the quiet sanctuary of my Boise apartment, brewing a second cup of dark roast coffee. I did not need to be physically present in the building to know exactly how the execution would unfold. A younger cousin named Megan, an observant woman who historically remained neutral and avoided the toxic family crossfire, provided a remarkably detailed real-time account through a series of lengthy text messages. According to Megan, my parents arrived precisely 10 minutes before the opening hymn, adhering to their usual strategy of making a highly visible entrance. Douglas wore his immaculate charcoal suit, though he appeared visibly aged, his posture lacking its customary rigid authority. Valerie walked rigidly beside him, wearing a conservative navy dress, her face locked into an unnervingly tight, artificial smile. They stepped through the heavy oak doors of the foyer, expecting the typical chorus of warm greetings and firm handshakes. Instead, they stepped into a suffocating, impenetrable vacuum. The low hum of pre-service chatter abruptly died the moment they crossed the threshold. Congregants standing near the entrance physically turned their bodies away, suddenly fascinated by the church bulletin boards or deeply engrossed in their hymnals. The crowd parted, creating a wide, undeniable path of avoidance. It was not a respectful yielding of space. It was the visceral, instinctual retreat of a community terrified of contamination. In a culture obsessed with respectability politics, association with federal wire fraud and identity theft was a terminal disease. Douglas and Valerie continued walking down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing far too loudly in the strained silence. They reached the third row, the designated territory for our extended family hierarchy. Aunt Susan sat at the edge of the polished wooden bench. Susan was the undisputed gatekeeper of family morality, a woman who previously championed Paige's pageant victories and completely ignored my academic achievements. Susan built her entire personality around maintaining a flawless, righteous image. Valerie offered a brittle, trembling greeting and moved to slide into the empty space on the pew beside her sister. Megan described the next moment as the most brutal, flawless social excommunication she had ever witnessed. Aunt Susan did not return the greeting. She did not offer a sympathetic smile. Instead, Susan looked directly at Valerie, her expression completely devoid of warmth. Slowly, deliberately, Susan reached for her expensive designer handbag resting on the cushion between them. She picked up the purse and pulled it tightly against her own ribcage, clutching the leather straps with both hands. She physically secured her belongings, an unmistakable, deeply insulting gesture, indicating she believed the woman attempting to sit next to her was a common thief. Valerie froze, her face draining of all color. The pebble of that single, conspicuous movement triggered an absolute avalanche. The surrounding cousins and uncles shifted uncomfortably, refusing to make eye contact with my parents. Douglas stood paralyzed in the aisle, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered visibly beneath his skin. Unable to force their way into the hostile family row, my parents were forced to retreat toward the back of the sanctuary, ultimately sitting alone in the very last pew near the exit doors. Following the conclusion of the sermon, Valerie attempted a desperate final maneuver to salvage her destroyed reality. During the community coffee hour in the fellowship hall, she cornered a small group of older women. Megan watched from a distance as Valerie desperately tried to spin the catastrophic narrative. Valerie laughed nervously, waving her hand in a dismissive gesture. She claimed the entire situation was merely a massive loan misunderstanding. She insisted the bank made a terrible clerical error regarding the trust funds and promised that Paige's boutique would open next week once the minor paperwork issues were resolved. Nobody believed a single word she spoke. The community possessed the undeniable facts. They knew about the canceled lease. They knew about the criminal lawyers. They simply stared at Valerie with a mixture of profound pity and cold disgust. The very enablers who spent decades helping my mother build her pedestal were now eagerly dismantling it plank by plank. The extended family, realizing they had actively supported criminals and praised a parasitic sibling while ostracizing the actual victim, washed their hands of the Bennett patriarch and matriarch completely. My parents left the church before the coffee hour concluded. They walked out to their luxury truck, completely alone, socially exiled from the only ecosystem that ever gave their lives meaning. I read the final text message from Megan, locked the screen of my device, and leaned back against my sofa. A profound sense of societal justice washed over me. I achieved this total victory without ever raising my voice. I did not launch a smear campaign. I did not post frantic, emotional paragraphs on social media defending my character. I utilized absolute strategic silence. I simply handed the undeniable truth to the authorities and allowed the inherently fragile nature of fake prestige to shatter under the weight of its own reality. The isolation of my abusers was now absolute. They were trapped in a rural community that despised them, locked inside a farmhouse poisoned by their own failures. My mother could no longer leverage her social standing to manipulate outcomes. My father could no longer use his reputation to intimidate those around him. They were entirely bankrupt of social capital. But social bankruptcy was merely the precursor to the final, devastating phase of their punishment. The illusion of their wealth was gone, but the literal physical debt remained entirely real. My phone rang, slicing through the quiet tranquility of my apartment. The caller identification displayed the name of Victor Thorne, my corporate litigator. I answered the call, my voice steady and completely devoid of sentimentality. Thorne skipped the pleasantries, diving directly into the legal mechanics of our aggressive strategy. He informed me that the criminal affidavits and the commercial lease severances successfully cornered my father. Vanguard Property Management formally released my Social Security number from the guarantor contract, transferring the entire $500,000 liability exclusively to Douglas Bennett. Furthermore, to avoid an immediate federal indictment for the forged bank withdrawal, Douglas was forced to sign the comprehensive restitution agreement Thorne drafted yesterday. My father was legally bound to repay the stolen $250,000 plus punitive damages and all associated attorney fees within a rigid 30-day window. Thorne paused, the sharp edge of a predatory smile audible in his tone. He informed me that Douglas lacked the liquid assets to meet the deadline. His bank accounts remained frozen. His credit was destroyed. My father possessed only one tangible asset capable of satisfying the massive legal debt he incurred by stealing my future: the generational agricultural land. The sprawling, pristine acreage that served as the pride and the anchor of the Bennett family legacy for over 8 decades. Thorne informed me that the forced liquidation paperwork was already filed with the county clerk. The farm was going up for public auction. The final, catastrophic consequence of their entitlement was arriving, and it was going to cost my father the very earth beneath his heavy work boots. The Bennett acreage occupied a sprawling, fertile stretch of the Treasure Valley, standing as a physical monument to 80 years of unyielding agricultural dominance. 3 generations of men had turned that specific soil, coaxing prosperity from the harsh western climate. My grandfather purchased the initial parcels during a time when survival required relentless physical labor and unbreakable integrity. He built a respected enterprise through honest sweat. When Douglas inherited the deed, he twisted that proud legacy into a weapon of social superiority. My father utilized the expansive property not merely as a source of income, but as a massive, tangible shield. The sprawling fields, the towering grain silos, and the pristine homestead provided him with an aura of untouchable prestige. He believed that owning the earth made him a king, rendering him immune to the consequences of his own arrogance. That delusion violently ended on a crisp Tuesday morning. I did not need to drive past the property to witness the execution of his ego. My attorney dispatched an independent asset evaluator to document the proceedings. The photographs arrived in my secure inbox just before noon. The images captured a heavy rusted steel stake being hammered ruthlessly into the frost-hardened dirt at the primary entrance of the estate. The sharp metallic edge severed the manicured grass, violating the pristine boundary of the compound. Attached to those brutal metal posts hung a massive, unforgiving commercial real estate placard. The bold red lettering declared the entire multi-generational homestead available for immediate public auction under a court-ordered forced liquidation. That simple painted sign represented the absolute death of a patriarch. The community driving past the highway would see that vibrant red warning and instantly understand the magnitude of his downfall. His armor was officially stripped away. Without his precious dirt, Douglas was reduced to nothing more than a desperate aging man facing insurmountable debt. The contrast between that sprawling organic heritage and the sterile environment of the downtown law firm was staggeringly absolute. I sat inside a high-altitude conference room encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass. The interior design projected cold, calculated efficiency. The massive table consisted of polished chrome and frosted glass, offering zero warmth and no comforting nostalgia. This space was designed for the clinical extraction of assets. It was an arena where toxic parental authority held absolutely zero jurisdiction. Victor Thorne sat beside me, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, his demeanor radiating predatory calm. We waited in silence as the mahogany doors swung open. Douglas entered the room completely alone. Valerie remained absent, likely too paralyzed by her recent social excommunication at the church to face the humiliating legal mechanics of their financial ruin. My father looked physically diminished. The broad, intimidating posture he cultivated for decades had completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward under the invisible crushing weight of his impending bankruptcy. He wore a faded denim jacket and scuffed work boots, garments that previously signaled his rugged authenticity, but now merely highlighted his total defeat. He did not attempt to sit at the head of the long table. He pulled out a chair directly across from me, his movements sluggish and heavy. Thorne wasted no time on pleasantries. The litigator pushed a thick, meticulously bound stack of settlement documents across the smooth glass surface. The crisp, white pages detailed the exact terms of my father's surrender. The legal jargon was merciless and absolute. The contract formally transferred the entire $500,000 liability of the fraudulent commercial lease away from my stolen identity and squarely onto his shoulders. Furthermore, the documents mandated the immediate, unconditional sale of the agricultural property to satisfy the $250,000 he stole from my trust fund, plus exorbitant punitive damages and all associated attorney fees. If he refused to sign, Thorne promised to hand the forged authorization forms directly to the federal prosecutor waiting on standby, guaranteeing an immediate criminal indictment and a lengthy prison sentence. Douglas stared at the bold print detailing the auction of his land. His weathered hands trembled slightly, hovering over the paperwork. The reality of his situation finally breached his stubborn psychological defenses. He was losing his kingdom to avoid a jail cell. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim a fraction of his lost control, he reverted to his oldest strategy. He attempted to weaponize my conscience. He lifted his gaze, locking his bloodshot eyes onto mine. He sought the obedient, terrified little girl he spent 28 years conditioning, hoping to exploit any remaining shred of daughterly devotion. "Are you truly satisfied with this outcome?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of grief and simmering rage. "Your grandfather poured his literal lifeblood into those fields. He built this family name from the dust. And you are forcing a public auction. You are ripping our entire history apart over a temporary financial dispute. You are destroying the Bennett legacy, Nora. How will you ever sleep knowing you erased everything your ancestors built?" He expected me to shrink. He expected the overwhelming magnitude of generational guilt to soften my resolve. He desperately wanted me to absorb the blame for the catastrophic destruction of his life. I did not break eye contact. I did not fidget, sigh, or display a single ounce of hesitation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool glass table, ensuring my posture communicated absolute, impenetrable strength. I let his manipulative words hang in the silent, heavily air-conditioned room, until they lost all their intended power. "I am not the architect of your ruin," I stated, my voice echoing with icy surgical precision. "You destroyed the legacy the exact moment you picked up that brass pen and forged my signature." The sentence struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes darting away from my unwavering stare. The illusion he desperately tried to maintain shattered into a million irreparable fragments. He could no longer pretend I was a vindictive child throwing a tantrum. He was forced to acknowledge that I was a rational adult executing a perfectly legal, morally justified consequence for his own felony. The crisp professional atmosphere of the corporate law firm sharply contrasted with his rapid emotional unraveling. He recognized that his manipulative tactics were completely useless in this environment. The laws of mathematics and contractual obligation did not care about his patriarchal ego. Defeated Douglas reached forward. He did not retrieve the heavy, custom indigo ink pen from his shirt pocket. That specific writing instrument was currently sealed inside an evidence bag in my attorney possession. Instead, my father picked up a cheap, generic plastic ballpoint provided by the firm. He pressed the plastic tip against the signature line. He signed his name, the jagged strokes reflecting his profound despair. He initialed the margins, legally binding himself to total financial ruin. He surrendered the deed to the property, the rights to the equipment, and the massive commercial debt he acquired for his golden child. The ink dried rapidly on the stark white paper, finalizing the destruction of his empire. The meeting adjourned without another word spoken. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the glass doors, a broken man, returning to a kingdom he no longer owned. However, the vacuum created by his absolute collapse introduced a dangerous new variable into the equation. With the parents officially bankrupt and their assets scheduled for liquidation, the protective barrier surrounding my sister vanished entirely. Paige was completely exposed. The pampered, entitled influencer who demanded $250,000 to fund her vanity project was suddenly faced with a mountain of angry creditors, a ruined public reputation, and absolutely zero operating capital. The golden child was about to experience a terrifying, unmitigated freefall into the harsh reality of the American working class, and she lacked the essential survival skills required to cushion the devastating impact. The protective financial barrier surrounding my sibling completely evaporated the moment my father surrendered his assets in that high-altitude conference room. Paige found herself violently thrust into the unforgiving machinery of the American working class. For her entire existence, she curated a digital identity built on unearned luxury and effortless privilege. Reality, however, demanded immediate payment. The angry electrical contractor who plunged her launch event into darkness did not simply walk away. He filed a mechanics lien. The vendors who supplied the abandoned Italian leather display tables initiated aggressive collection protocols. The municipal courts bombarded her apartment with formal summons. Without our parents to absorb the financial shockwave, Paige faced total economic obliteration. She desperately needed liquid capital to secure basic legal representation and prevent a devastating personal bankruptcy ruling. Therefore, the self-proclaimed luxury lifestyle influencer was forced to acquire a traditional wage-earning occupation. She possessed no university degree. She held zero marketable corporate skills. She lacked any history of reliable employment. Consequently, her options were brutally limited. Through the local grapevine, I learned she secured a position at a regional logistics warehouse located on the gritty industrial outskirts of Boise. She was not hired for a glamorous marketing role. She secured a temporary minimum wage assignment functioning as a low-tier data entry clerk. The sheer poetic justice of her situation was absolute. For years, Valerie openly sneered at my career trajectory. My mother routinely mocked my data analytics profession, dismissing my grueling 60-hour work weeks as boring, invisible spreadsheet labor, completely inferior to my sister's vibrant entrepreneurial spirit. Now, the disgraced golden child spent 8 hours a day sitting inside a sterile, windowless gray cubicle under harsh fluorescent lighting. Paige was forced to manually input hundreds of alphanumeric shipping codes into a flickering monitor just to afford her monthly utility bills. She became trapped in the exact analytical grind our mother previously treated with profound contempt. While my sister plummeted into the bleak reality of minimum wage labor, my own professional trajectory launched into the stratosphere. The psychological energy I previously wasted navigating my family's toxic emotional minefield was now entirely redirected into my corporate output. My focus became razor sharp. My productivity metrics at the agricultural tech firm skyrocketed. Executive leadership noticed the relentless, flawless execution of my software integrations. During a quarterly performance review, the chief technology officer did not merely offer me a standard raise. He offered me a massive leap across the organizational chart. I was officially promoted to the prestigious role of Senior Systems Architect, complete with a substantial salary increase, comprehensive equity options, and a private corner workspace. Moving into that elevated office provided a deeply visceral, tactile confirmation of my victory. I stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway, holding the physical manifestation of my new authority. It was a heavy, custom-engraved brass nameplate. The polished metal gleamed under the warm ambient lighting. I aligned the brass rectangle with the mounting bracket secured to the center of the heavy mahogany door. I pushed it forward. The heavy, satisfying slide of the metal slipping perfectly into the grooved bracket resonated with a sharp, definitive click. That crisp sound symbolized the impenetrable fortress I built using my own intellect and endurance. No one handed me that title. I earned every single ounce of that brass. My newfound corporate stability coincided perfectly with the arrival of tangible legal restitution. A week after my promotion, a certified courier delivered a thick envelope to my new corner office. The return address belonged to Victor Thorne. I sliced the heavy paper open using a steel letter opener. Inside rested a brief, formally typed memorandum confirming the initial liquidation phase of the Bennett agricultural estate. Pinned securely behind the legal brief was a certified cashier check printed on secure bank paper. The numerical figure stamped across the designated line was staggering. It represented the full recovery of my stolen grandfather trust, augmented significantly by the court-mandated punitive damages and the complete reimbursement of my aggressive legal fees. Holding that slip of paper produced an electrifying surge of validation. That check was not merely a transfer of wealth. It functioned as a physical, legally binding receipt of their accountability. It proved that their delusions of superiority could not withstand the crushing weight of the judicial system. I did not experience a single shred of guilt while looking at those numbers. I deposited the massive sum directly into a high-yield, heavily diversified investment portfolio. I locked the capital away behind layers of biometric security and dual authentication protocols, ensuring my restored future remained entirely untouchable. Society consistently pressures victims of familial abuse to pursue reconciliation. Cultural narratives aggressively push the concept that holding on to anger is toxic, insisting that true healing requires extending grace to those who harmed you. They tell you to be the bigger person. They tell you that blood is thicker than water. Let me tell you the absolute truth about survival. You do not have to forgive people who are not sorry. You just have to make sure they can never touch you again. Forgiveness is a gift reserved for those who demonstrate genuine remorse and actively repair the damage they inflicted. My parents did not regret stealing my future. They only regretted facing the litigator I hired to crush them. Therefore, they received zero absolution from me. I chose the profound, unshakable peace of absolute detachment. The chaotic, relentless pace of the overlapping conflicts finally surrendered to a deep, resonant sense of earned stability. I transitioned permanently from the victimized, invisible scapegoat into an untouchable powerhouse. My environment was secure, my boundaries were fortified, my financial independence was guaranteed. Yet the final chapter of this saga remained unwritten. The massive influx of recovered capital sitting comfortably in my investment accounts presented a fascinating new tactical opportunity. The forced liquidation of my father's empire was currently happening in stages. The heavy farm equipment and the secondary parcels funded my restitution check, but the crown jewel of the Bennett legacy still awaited its fate. The sprawling primary homestead, featuring the historic farmhouse and the most fertile agricultural soil in the Treasure Valley, was officially slated for public auction next week. The general public assumed a corporate conglomerate would acquire the land and pave over the fields. However, a senior systems architect understands that the most effective way to permanently dismantle an obsolete structure is to purchase the foundation and build something entirely new on top of the ruins. The public auction of the Bennett Agricultural Estate occurred on a remarkably brisk Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. A sparse crowd gathered on the concrete steps, buzzing with hushed, speculative gossip regarding the spectacular financial collapse of our prominent family. Local developers and corporate agricultural representatives stood clutching their bidding paddles, anticipating a lucrative acquisition. Douglas stood near the back of the small assembly, completely broken, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. He was forced to witness the humiliating spectacle of his generational kingdom being sold to the highest bidder to satisfy his massive legal debts. The community fully expected a massive out-of-state conglomerate to purchase the sprawling acreage and pave over the fertile topsoil to construct a high-density subdivision. The auctioneer rattled off the numbers with practiced, dizzying speed. However, the aggressive corporate bidders were swiftly outmaneuvered by a local attorney representing a blind trust registered under a generic corporate moniker. The faceless entity operating as Apex Valley Holdings submitted the final, uncontested bid. Because my father desperately needed to clear the staggering legal penalties, and the bank wanted the fraudulent commercial lease wiped from their ledgers immediately, the property sold for pennies on the actual dollar. Douglas watched the auctioneer slam the heavy wooden gavel against the podium, officially transferring the deed of his ancestors to an anonymous corporation. He walked away from the courthouse, completely stripped of his identity, entirely unaware of the identity of the new owner. He did not know that Apex Valley Holdings was a private limited liability company, entirely owned and operated by me. I utilized the massive restitution check, heavily augmented by my lucrative salary as a senior systems architect, to effortlessly acquire the property. The absolute breathtaking poetry of the transaction provided a satisfaction so profound it practically hummed in my veins. My father drained my grandfather trust to fund a fraudulent, vain illusion. I used those exact recovered funds to purchase my grandfather's actual physical legacy. I bought the very ground my father walked on, legally removing him from the premises and securing the land strictly under my own unassailable authority. 6 months have passed since the gavel fell on those courthouse steps. Today is a quiet, exceptionally peaceful Sunday morning in the Treasure Valley. I am currently standing on the expansive wraparound wooden porch of the historic Bennett farmhouse. The structure belongs entirely to me. I hold a warm ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee, feeling the comforting heat seep into my palms. The crisp, clean Idaho air fills my lungs as I watch the golden sunrise spill over the jagged peaks of the distant foothills. The sprawling fields stretching out before me are no longer dedicated to traditional back-breaking harvest cycles. Instead, I am watching a highly skilled crew of commercial contractors actively transforming the property. They are currently gutting the massive multi-level timber barn located roughly 100 yards from the main house. The rusted animal stalls and the decaying wooden lofts are completely gone. In their place, the workers are installing heavy-duty fiber optic cables, sleek architectural glass panels, and advanced climate-controlled server racks. I did not purchase this massive estate to become a traditional farmer. I purchased it to serve as the physical, innovative headquarters for my own emerging agricultural technology startup. I am blending the deep organic roots of my heritage with the boundless potential of my digital expertise. I am building a legitimate, highly profitable empire on the exact same soil where my parents told me I possessed absolutely zero potential. The contrast between my current reality and the bleak existence of my abusers is absolute. Douglas, the former patriarch who believed owning land made him an untouchable king, is now experiencing the grueling reality of the working class. Destitute and stripped of his retirement savings, my father was forced to secure manual employment just to survive. He currently works as a hired hourly farmhand for a massive corporate agricultural conglomerate located 2 towns over. The man who used to command a fleet of workers now clocks in at dawn operating heavy machinery on land he will never own, taking direct orders from regional managers half his age. His back aches. His authority is non-existent, and his ego is permanently shattered. Valerie is experiencing a punishment uniquely tailored to her specific, superficial values. She currently resides in a cramped, poorly insulated 2-bedroom duplex located on the undesirable industrial side of the city. Her punishment, however, is not merely financial. It is profoundly social. She is an absolute pariah. Whenever she attempts to navigate the aisles of the local supermarket, former friends and fellow church congregants physically turn their shopping carts around to avoid making eye contact. The affluent community she sacrificed her soul to impress now treats her like an invisible ghost. She spends her days entirely isolated, trapped inside a tiny apartment possessing no social currency and nobody left to manipulate. And Paige remains firmly anchored to the bottom rung of the corporate ladder. The golden child is still trapped beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights of that bleak logistics warehouse. Her wages are aggressively garnished every single pay period to satisfy the lingering creditors from her disastrous boutique failure. She spends her youth staring blankly at a spreadsheet, manually inputting shipping codes, entirely stripped of her designer wardrobe and her digital audience. Her beauty and her entitlement proved completely useless when confronted with binding legal contracts and a mountain of authentic debt. Our society is deeply conditioned by cinema and television to expect a grand emotional reconciliation at the end of every family conflict. People anticipate a tearful hospital bedside confession, a dramatic holiday dinner where the abusers finally apologize, and a heartwarming montage where the fractured family magically heals. Real life operates with far more clinical precision. There was no grand reconciliation in my story. There were no tearful apologies or dramatic reunions. There is only absolute silence and impenetrable architectural boundaries. I do not speak to them. They do not have my new phone number. They are legally barred from stepping onto this property. I did not require their genuine remorse to move forward because I realized their validation was entirely worthless. I successfully transitioned from the invisible, victimized scapegoat into an untouchable powerhouse. I secured my environment, fortified my finances, and eliminated every single toxic variable from my daily equation. I built a beautiful, thriving existence by simply refusing to shrink, refusing to absorb their crimes and refusing to participate in their collective delusion. I want to leave you with a singular, unbreakable truth. If you are currently sitting at a kitchen table, listening to people dismiss your potential, or if you are quietly enduring the theft of your resources by the individuals who were supposed to protect you, hear this clearly. Your worth isn't determined by the people who steal from you. It's built by what you do after you lock the door. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story resonated with your own experiences, if you have ever had to enforce brutal, necessary boundaries to protect your own future from a toxic family system, please share your survival story in the comments below. We build our strength by sharing our truth. Subscribe to the channel, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one. We often look at the shattered remains of a family and ask what sudden, violent storm tore their foundation apart. We search for a singular, catastrophic event to explain the collapse of decades of shared history. But houses rarely fall overnight. The destruction of a family does not begin with a lawsuit or a public screaming match in a parking lot. It begins much earlier, in the quiet, mundane moments of daily life. It begins at the kitchen table. It begins with the subtle, normalized allocation of affection. It begins when parents decide that one child represents their ambitions, while another child exists merely to absorb their disappointments. The story of the Bennett family serves as a profound mirror held up to the very core of modern American culture. In our society, we place a massive, almost religious premium on the concept of the traditional family structure. We revere the imagery of the sprawling homestead, the manicured lawns, the coordinated Sunday church attendance, and the unified, respectable front presented to the neighborhood. We are culturally conditioned to equate outward prestige with inward morality. We teach our children that material success, public validation, and social currency are the ultimate indicators of a life well lived. Douglas and Valerie constructed their entire identities around this specific, dangerous American illusion. They believed that as long as the exterior of their home appeared flawless, the rot festering within their walls simply did not matter. But parenting is not a public relations campaign. Raising children is a sacred, heavy responsibility that demands absolute, unwavering honesty. Honesty in parenting does not merely mean telling the truth about where you left the car keys. It requires a deep, uncomfortable emotional awareness. It demands that parents look at their children and see them for who they actually are, rather than utilizing those children as props to reflect their own unfulfilled desires. When parents lack this emotional awareness, they stop raising human beings and start curating an exhibit. Consider the tragedy of the golden child. It is incredibly easy to view the favored sibling as the ultimate victor in a toxic household. They receive the financial backing, the endless praise, and the unearned opportunities. But examine the long-term guidance provided by that specific brand of parenting. When parents remove every single obstacle from a child's pathway, when they fund every frivolous whim and actively shield that child from the natural consequences of their own actions, they are not practicing love. They are practicing a very insidious form of neglect. Douglas and Valerie believed they were securing a beautiful future for Paige by stealing resources to hand her a luxury business. In reality, they were systematically disabling her. By denying her the opportunity to fail, they denied her the opportunity to build resilience. They raised a person completely devoid of loyalty, a fragile narcissist who violently turned on them the exact second the stolen money evaporated. Overindulgence without accountability is just sabotage wrapped in expensive wrapping paper. Conversely, the story reveals the profound, heavy burden placed upon the scapegoat. Fairness is the bedrock of trust within any family unit. When fairness is repeatedly violated, a deep, silent fracture occurs. Parents frequently mistake a child's quiet endurance for compliance. They assume that because the overlooked daughter is not shouting, she is not paying attention. But the unloved child is always paying attention. They are learning that love is conditional. They are learning that their worth is measured only by their utility. True family responsibility means recognizing that the quiet, dutiful child needs just as much emotional protection as the loud, demanding one. By forcing Nora to navigate her existence entirely alone, her parents inadvertently forged a woman made of absolute steel. They taught her that the only person she could rely on was herself. They created the very architect of their own demise. We must ask ourselves what kind of legacy we are truly leaving for the next generation. A genuine legacy is not comprised of agricultural land trust funds or the opinions of country club associates. A real legacy is built on the moral architecture you instill in your children. It is built on the assurance that your love is equitable, that your boundaries are healthy, and that your actions match your words. If you raise your children in an environment where respect must be purchased and affection is treated as a limited commodity, you will inevitably reap a harvest of bitter isolation. If you find yourself reflecting deeply on the intricate, often painful dynamics of family relationships, and if you appreciate narratives that peel back the perfect facade to reveal the raw truth underneath, I encourage you to follow Zara Told Stories. We explore the complex, hidden corners of human connection, bringing you stories that challenge your perspective and validate your experiences. Join our community and discover more narratives that hold a mirror up to the reality we all navigate every single day. As we close the chapter on the Bennett family, we are left to ponder a deeply unsettling reality about the nature of forgiveness and obligation. Conventional wisdom aggressively dictates that family is everything. We are fed a constant cultural narrative insisting that blood is thicker than water, that grudges are toxic, and that true healing absolutely requires us to forgive those who raised us. We are told that no matter how deep the wound, a child owes their parents grace simply by virtue of existence. I challenge you to completely discard that conventional wisdom. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can show your family is to allow them to face the exact unmitigated consequences of their own choices. Sometimes the healthiest, most functional family structure is the one you actively dismantle. We are taught from a very young age that a parent love for their child should be unconditional. But perhaps we must embrace the shocking reality that a child loyalty to their parents should never be unconditional. You do not owe your future to the people who actively tried to destroy it, even if those people share your last name. True peace is not found by sitting at a table with people who quietly despise you. True peace is found when you realize you have the power to stand up, walk out the door, and build a completely new table of your own. Look at the empty chairs in your own life. Are they empty because you failed? Or are they empty because you finally decided you were worth more than the lies you were being served?